That's the meaning of that document and the principles in it. And if you are the sitting communist government in China, the last thing you want are your subjects thinking that all men are created equal and the only legitimate government is government by consent of the governed. You have to get rid of that, and you have to send a message. So here's my conclusion about Jefferson. He wasn't an angel. He was not an angel. And I always like to ask people in the audience, who among us is? Do you know anybody who asserts principles and doesn't live up perfectly to those principles? How about every single one of us? If that's the best you have on Jefferson, that he didn't live up to his principles, fine. I don't know anyone who does. But he did assert those principles, and we owe him a great debt for that. If you look on page, I want to give you a little sense here of how unique this is. Look on page 3. This comes from the Notes on the State of Virginia, the second paragraph. And here's what Jefferson writes. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submission on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and is thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, and cannot be but stamped by it with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. Here's what's amazing to me about that class of people, the founders. Every single one of them denounced slavery in principle. They understood it was wrong and took many actions against it. When you think of the Founding Fathers, we always think of them as adults, right? You go to Washington, D.C., and all the monuments are of adults. And yet these people were little kids. Imagine little Georgie Washington. Imagine 3-year-old Tommy Jefferson. And then he's 5, and then he's 7. Right? What a pain in the ass he must have been as a kid. Think of these guys as little kids growing up. What is their world? The world they see is a world where white people own black people. On our college campuses today, we talk endlessly about culture, the importance of culture. We have cultural celebration days. Well, you know what? That was their culture. And those men had enough insight to step out of their own culture and look at it and judge it and say, you know what? There's something rotten to the core about this. And we're going to change it. And they did. This problem nearly broke the Union apart during the convention to draft the Constitution. We already had a Constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which had all kinds of problems. So a convention of delegates convenes in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And most of what we know about that comes from James Madison. He took very detailed notes day to day, who was giving speeches on what subjects, so on and so forth. And Madison says in his notes that the most divisive subject that nearly broke the convention was slavery. And I want to give you a few examples of how this came to be. If you take a look at page 4, I've given you the slavery clauses in the Constitution. You probably recall early in the convention, the first big fight was between the larger states and the smaller states. New York, Virginia, they stand up. They're discussing the legislative branch. What is this thing going to look like? What exactly is it going to do? How will the states be represented in the legislature, whatever it is? And New York and Virginia make arguments and say, look, we're bigger. We have more people. Therefore, we're going to be contributing more money to this government, whatever it does. If this government ever goes to war, more of our sons are going to go fight and bleed and possibly die. Therefore, we, the larger states, we want more representation. We want a larger share. We want to be able to send more representatives. It's a perfectly fair argument. To which several of the smaller states respond. Connecticut, Delaware, they stand up and they say, wait a minute. We might be smaller in population, but we're equally states. We want equal representation. We're no less of a state than New York is. There's a big fight, and a great compromise is reached. The compromise is, let's divide the legislative branch into two separate chambers, a House of Representatives, where representation will be proportional based on population, and a Senate in which representation will be equal. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of how large or how small it might be. At this time, delegates from Georgia stand up. And they say, you know, we like this arrangement. This is a great arrangement. And we're really interested in this House of Representatives. Now, our understanding is that the number of representatives we get is based on our population, right? Yes, that's what it is. Okay, so when we calculate our population, we get to count all of our slaves, right? And do you know what their first justification was? They're people too. They're people too. They're going to be living under these laws. We want to count every single one of them. Hell, they would have been happy to count their slaves as 2 or 3 because it would have meant a bigger population and therefore send more representatives to Congress. And they add to that a threat. They say if we don't get to count our slaves, we're being ripped off of representation and we're out of here. We're going to leave. This union is a joke. We're not going to be part of it. We'll go. At that point, South Carolina stands up and says, we second that. We'll go too. Now think about this in a larger political context. In 1787, how many republics are there in the world? The United States of America. We had just finished a fight with an imperial European power, Great Britain, the British Empire. How did that go for the Americans? Was that by any measure a slam dunk victory? No, we barely squeaked out a victory, and that was with all 13 states united. What would happen if America went to war, but America was divided into 2, 3, 4 bickering little republics? Probably we would be smashed by European powers, and monarchical rule of some form would be replanted on American soil. So those threats of disunion by Georgia and South Carolina and other southern states, these are massively important. You have to keep the union together if there's any hope for free Republican self-government. But what do you do with people who want to count slaves? In sort of a abstract, theoretical way, the most moral position, I think my first response, I would have said, you know what you can do with your slaves? You can count them as 0. 0. Not because they're not human beings, because they're not being represented. I think I would have responded to Georgia and say, you want to count your slaves? Let them vote. Make them citizens. Then you can count all of them. But why should Georgia get more representation simply because they have imported hundreds of thousands of human beings through the Atlantic slave trade? Well, northern delegates have a choice to make, right? They can either refuse, they can reject. They can tell Georgia to go to hell. You're immoral, we hate slavery, we're not going to let you count all your slaves and dominate the national government because of slavery. You could do that, and you could pat yourself on the back, congratulate yourself for having stood by your principle. And if you do that, what happens? What does the South do? They leave. And if the South leaves because they failed to get adequate protection and recognition for their slaves, is it fair to assume that any Southern Confederacy that would have been formed in 1787 probably would have featured the strictest permanent protections for slavery imaginable? In other words, if you were a Northern delegate in that convention and you opposed the demands of the South and they left, you would have made life more of a living hell on earth for every black slave than it already was. You would have done no good and potentially much harm. Well, that's not the choice that delegates make. Instead, we get a string of speeches, some of the most beautiful speeches during the convention, denouncing slavery in principle, arguing it's unjust, it's unfair, it's sinful, it violates the central principle of the revolution. However, our immediate purpose is to keep a union together. So you southern states, how about if we offer you this deal? We can't stomach to give you complete representation for all these slaves who don't get to vote. What if you count them all up and take 3/5 of that number and add it to your free population? And Georgia says, deal, we'll take it. That's how we get the 3/5 clause in Article 1, Section 2 that I've given you on page 4. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, their population, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons 3/5 of all other persons. Everywhere in the Constitution, by the way, the Constitution only recognizes persons. The Constitution never mentions any color. The word black appears nowhere in the Constitution. The word white appears nowhere in the Constitution. The word slave or slavery appears nowhere in the Constitution. These are all persons, but there are two different kinds of persons under the law. There are free persons under the law, and there are persons who are not free under the law. And that's how we're going to decide the population. So far from being a statement of white supremacy or bigotry or racism, I argue that the 3/5 clause positively proves or demonstrates that every one of the framers of the Constitution recognized the humanity of those African slaves. Here's why. Do you think anyone made a demand to count their mules as part of their population? Why not, right? If you could count your mules and your cows and your horses, your population would be bigger. Nobody demanded that. Why? Because everyone in that room knew mules aren't people. Why did they fight over whether to count slaves or not? Because every single person recognized these are human beings, but they're not being protected under the law as human beings. What do you do about that? Jump to the next two clauses. I'll summarize them very briefly. Article 1, Section 9 is the importation clause. Again, Georgia was just a pain in the ass in the Constitutional Convention. Georgia gets up and says, many of our constituents, their livelihood depends on purchasing slave labor. Therefore, they want to buy low. They want slave labor to be as cheap as possible. Well, if you want the price to be low, that means you want the supply to be high. Where is there an almost unlimited supply of chattel slaves? Africa. So they make a demand. They say, we want a provision in the Constitution, not just a statutory law that can be repealed later, in the Constitution, that Congress may never interfere with the Atlantic slave trade. We want to make sure the Atlantic slave trade is open forever. And if we don't get that, we leave the Union. At that moment, Hamilton and several others, they offer some speeches. It's almost hard to read these things. I don't know if you people have ever studied the details of the Atlantic slave trade, but it's horrific. It's hard to read it and keep your stomach down. There were these very elaborate slave trading posts on the west coast of Africa. You know how those slaves got there, right? The Europeans did not run through the jungles of Africa and club Africans on the head. African tribes would make war on their neighboring tribes, typically slaughter most of the men and take whoever remains and drag them to the west coast, and they became slaves. That's how you got to be a slave. And these trading ships would show up, and they would buy hundreds at a time. And in order to get them on, these slave ships had special hulls where each level was sometimes only 4 or 5 feet tall. It wasn't even tall enough to stand up to. So the slaves had to lie down, chained to the floor, 3, 4, 5 levels of it. And by the time they got to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, a third of them were no longer slaves. They were bloating, rotting corpses. And the kind of squalor and stench and disease and filth that those people experienced is unlike, it's almost unimaginable.